Welcome everybody to today's Digital Futures workshop organized by the Quello Center at Michigan State University. I am Johannes Bauer. I'm the director of the Quello Center. And it's my incredible pleasure today to introduce and welcome Silvia Lindtner, who is currently an associate professor at the University of Michigan at the School of Information. But she also has a lot of other activities that are very impressive and very engaged and originate, as I read it, in her background, on the one hand in computer science with a PhD from UC Irvine, but also in media technology and design. So she has a courtesy appointment in design at Michigan too. She is the associate director of the Center for Ethics, Society and Computing, or ESCAPE, which she co-founded with Christian Sandvik and others at the University of Michigan. She's also a founding member of Precarity Lab, a research collective that works on how digital technology interacts with forms of insecurity, vulnerability, and social and cultural exclusion. And then last but not least, I'd like to mention her role as a co-founder of Hacked Matter, a collaborative in Shanghai, or with Shanghai, I should say, maybe, together with Professor Arno Greenspan at NYU and David Lee, who actually founded the first Chinese hackerspace in Shanghai in 2010. And so she has lived in China for several years and engaged with sort of the maker movement, the hacker movement, the innovation processes in China. And I'm really looking forward to getting your insights on these processes at a time right, when the US is seeking to redefine its relationship to China, right? And there's probably many misunderstandings that inform discussion. So you're one of the few people who has a very deep inside view of those issues. And so the book that was just published by Princeton University Press is called Prototype Nation. And I'll turn it over to you, Silvia. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Johannes. I'm really delighted to be here. And many thanks to the Quello Center and the Digital Futures Workshop for inviting me and for all your hard work to make this remote presentation possible today. I'm really delighted to share with you all some of the key concepts and stories from this new book that Johannes just mentioned, Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation. And as Johannes was already alluding to, the book spans and draws from over 10 years of ethnographic research, out of which I spent 5 years full-time in China. And so my talk today will be weaving together specific stories and sites to examine the role digital tech production plays in contemporary governance in China, but also in geopolitics, labor, and policy. And so importantly, the book and also my talk today is a feminist ethnography of the global that aims to interrogate and challenge all too simplistic stories of what is often framed as perhaps a uniquely Chinese approach to innovation. So instead, I show both in the book and today that a study of tech production in China has much to say, not only about shifting processes of governance and policy in China, but also has a lot to say about Western imperialism, about Western control, about shifting geopolitics and shifting China-US relations. So that will be a big part of the talk today as well. And before I go into it, I promised Johannes to also share and plug our new center that he already mentioned, the Center for Ethics, Society and Computing, or ESCAPE, which we officially launched in January, just before the pandemic. So the center is an initiative to support and further amplify justice-oriented research, and to do so by working not only with researchers, but also with, importantly, activists, policymakers, educators, the tech industry. And so the center itself got its name from the escape key, so on the keyboard, which was added to the computer keyboard to interrupt a program when it produced unwanted results, allowing the system, so to say, to be critically examined. And so in the same spirit and in the same way, Escape is dedicated to intervening when computing technologies and digital media reproduce violence, sexism, racism, inequality, and exclusion. And of course, I'm very happy to talk more about Escape later in the Q&A today, and also how it relates to some of my own research that I will be talking about today. So I want to start with this image here. What you see here in front of you on the screen is a photo of one of China's early maker spaces called Chaihuo. It's a roughly 15 by 10 square meter room on the second floor of a refurbished factory building in a creative industry park in the city of Shenzhen in the south of China. It's a fairly small community space that provides its members with access to low-cost machines and open source tools to hack and tinker with electronics. So maker spaces or hacker spaces, as they were also often referred to, have proliferated in the thousands around the globe following the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis. So these hacker spaces, like Chaihuo here, were not the spaces frequented by the type of hackers that are often depicted in movies. You know, young men illegally accessing information or breaking security barriers would be sort of a typical image. The kind of hacking that took place at Chaihuo and other spaces like it was a project of self-transformation from a passive consumer into what many began calling a maker. And I also included the Chinese word here for maker, 创客. So a maker was somebody who intervened in social, economic, and political processes via technological experimentation. So that was sort of the project of the maker movement. And people who identified with this form of making produced a flurry of prototypes that made this particular promise of intervention concrete. This included, for instance, the DIY cell phone that demonstrated that you, rather than a big corporate player like Apple, can control the design and the inner workings of our communication devices. It included the opening up of proprietary health devices that demonstrated how you can regain ownership of your body's data, like this project here on the screen that hacked the glucose monitoring device Dexcom to create an artificial pancreas. And it included open source 3D printers like MakerBot that made palpable how you can mass produce in your own home. So these prototypes of intervention, so to say, demoed how to see oneself as capable of intervening in industrial production, automation, and even broken healthcare systems. They created a feeling of being able to intervene at scale from the individual body all the way to national and globalized industrial production. And they did so by promising to return the means of production to the people. This is illustrated really well by a quote from the book on the topic by Chris Anderson, the former editor-in-chief of Wired magazine in 2012, when he celebrated this promise of making as follows. This is the quote from the book. The ability to manufacture local or global at will, he said, is a huge advantage. That simple menu option, and he refers here to a 3D printer, compresses 3 centuries of industrial revolution into a single mouse click. If Karl Marx was here today, his jaw would be on the floor. Talk about controlling the tools of production. You can now set factories into motion with a mouse click. So Anderson's book was one of many other prominent writings on making at that time that invoked socialist imagery and language. So Anderson is not alone here. They claimed making as returning control to the people, as democratizing industrial production, and as a tool to achieve social justice and undo large corporate monopolies and state power. Unlike Marx, though, who understood alternatives to capitalism as emerging from class struggle, solidarity movements, and the collectivization of workers, these writings portrayed individual self-actualization as desirable. Notably here, Anderson describes making's transformative power as stemming not from a collective we, but from many individual you. So as he says, you can now set factories into motion, right? So these writings and projects really construed one of the core techniques of neoliberal governance, which is the framing of the self in economic terms as desirable and as a key to enabling social change. They produced what might seem at first like an inherent contradiction, what I call in the book a socialist pitch. So pitching is typically associated with a startup's ability to formulate itself as attractive to venture capital by producing a feeling of anticipation and a promise to scale. The socialist pitch, I argue, derives its power from this technique of producing an affect of exuberant excitement and buy-in by drawing specifically on the language and the image of social change and justice. So pitching typically works through promise rather than actual change. We see investors, for instance, fund ideas and prototypes rather than finished products. So the socialist pitch too, in that sense, is aimed not at social justice per se, but at creating a feeling that technological intervention itself is social justice. So Chaihuo Makerspace had become a well-known member of what prominent figures like Chris Anderson had pitched as a global movement that would return power and control to the people. This is not really the kind of space where one would expect to find the Prime Minister of China on an official state visit, though. But as surprising as it seems, China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang did indeed visit Chaihuo Makerspace and endorsed its prototypes of intervention on an official state visit in January 2015. And you see a photo of that visit here on the screen with the Prime Minister Li Keqiang in the middle. During his visit, the Prime Minister declared, "Makers show the vitality of entrepreneurship and innovation among the people, and such creativity will serve as a lasting engine of China's economic growth in the future." The Prime Minister's visit to Chaihuo was documented vividly by state media. The government website posted a photo essay, which includes some of the images here on the screen, portraying the Prime Minister surrounded by a crowd of young Chinese men who showed off their latest technological creations. The photos showed a highly personable Prime Minister, so somebody who appeared to be enjoying the mingling with the group of young men. And so the message was, as was reported later in the official state media, that the Prime Minister was himself a maker at heart and a politician who was invested in empowering citizens to make things happen. Most importantly, though, the endorsement of maker spaces like Chaihuo by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, posited the young men depicted side by side Prime Minister Li Keqiang as model makers, so as young Chinese engineers who had transformed themselves via the socialist pitch into entrepreneurial change makers, who would, so to say, by prototyping themselves, also prototype the nation anew. So this is something that I will come back to repeatedly in this talk today. So only a couple of months after the Prime Minister had returned to Beijing, he announced a new national policy that escalated making into a nationwide project. The policy was written around three key terms that you can see on the screen as well: mass makerspace, mass entrepreneurship, and mass innovation. So these terms really framed the policy's key directive, which called upon provincial, municipal, and district level governments to allocate existing resources towards setting up these so-called mass makerspaces that were modeled after Chaihuo, so to say. So the policy was aimed at, as it was literally articulated, at cultivating a maker spirit amongst the masses, a spirit that would in turn help foster an attitude of self-making, self-entrepreneurship. In other words, the policy held up making as a technique of self-transformation from an economic actor into an entrepreneurial actor. So in my book, Prototype Nation, I offer an ethnographic and genealogical study of making for what it can tell us about the role technology broadly plays in contemporary governance in China. I explore how the promise of democratized tech innovation, as championed by maker advocates, as I outlined it so far, became a techno-political instrument of affect. that served the government's broader interests to reposition China as a forward-looking and an innovative nation. Crucially, I argue, it mobilized feelings of optimism, positivity, and happiness in the very moment that the Chinese government feared social and political instability due to China's first significant economic slowdown since the opening reforms in the 1980s. So by prototype nation, then, I mean the stipulation that a nation can and should function as a prototype, that a nation and its citizenry serve as the raw material, so to say, for a new model. For instance, China as modeling an alternative to Western approaches of technology, innovation, and economic development. So the idea that a nation can function as a prototype, as a way of modeling a new way of life for others, is of course not new. It's historically constituted through projects of modernization, economic development, and colonization. The historian Arif Dirlik, for instance, reminds us that the European invention of the nation state was the ultimate vehicle of modernity. In other words, the European nation was posited as a prototype of modern progress and economic development, with Europe itself as the archetype. Other regions were construed as in need to learn from the Western model nations. And so this colonial project of prototyping a certain way of life, I argue, endures through the ideals and practices of contemporary technology innovation. Colonial pasts and racialized forms of violence reverberate through the prototype nation. And to show how exactly this unfolds is a key task of the book and is also my goal in this talk today. And as a feminist ethnography that weaves together sensibilities from critical race, post-colonial, and science and technology studies, the book attends to the bodies and sites that were excluded from this reinvestment in the nation and in certain people and regions with this exuberant feeling of excitement of future making. And I will talk about some of these exclusions also today. So it was no coincidence that China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang endorsed the makerspace Chaihuo located in the city of Shenzhen, rather than any of the other hundreds of such spaces that had already operated in China at the time. So the same year of Prime Minister Li Keqiang's visit to Shenzhen, Wired magazine published the following issue that claimed it was now time to copy China, with a series of essays about tech innovation in the city of Shenzhen. The cover that you can see here featured a story of Lei Jun, the founder of Xiaomi, a mobile phone company that had grown out of what many people had begun referring to as Shenzhen's unique innovation ecosystem. So Wired's cover was really a culmination, though, of Western media coverage about Shenzhen that had, within the time span of only a few years, rewritten the region in the global tech imagination. So what had long been decried as a site of mere execution of Western ideas, low quality and copycat production was celebrated as the Silicon Valley of hardware, as a hothouse of innovation. And you can see some of these examples here on the screen, as a place where hardware entrepreneurs would go and even outcompete Silicon Valley. So these stories proliferated in the years following the 2007 and 8 financial crisis. So a lot of these circulated sort of following, starting 2010 and 11. So the years following the crisis were really marked by a reckoning with the complicity of technology in things like labor exploitation, resource extraction, and capitalist expansion. So not only scholars, but also a growing number of news media began warning about the costs of ruthless neoliberal capitalism and the precarious work conditions it created. And increasingly, people criticized Silicon Valley as the central culprit in this destabilization. China as prototype nation, as a contested alternative to Western approaches to tech innovation, was co-produced by this specific techno-crisis thinking that was particularly pronounced in the United States. So it was a moment, in other words, when the tech industry and Silicon Valley in particular found itself confronted with a growing suspicion that the values it had propagated since the 1990s, the countercultural ideal of tearing down hierarchies and in the hierarchy's place create a peer-to-peer peer collaborative society, as communication scholar Fred Turner has described it, had really benefited only a small minority. And I'm sure many of you will recognize here on the screen Apple's 1984 ad for the Macintosh computer, which is sort of a canonical image of this countercultural ideal. It was in this very moment of suspicion of these tech promises that China, and more precisely the south of China, was re-articulated by a range of actors in the global tech industry, policy, and politics as a place where the future was now made, as newly innovative, exactly because it had long been and continued to be understood as not modern the same way as the West. So allow me to unpack some of this. For instance, in 2014, Joy Itu, who was at that time still director of the MIT Media Lab, traveled with a group of his students and faculty to Shenzhen. Upon his return, he gave a TED talk in which he argued that traveling to Shenzhen was like going back in time and learning from the past, momentarily reliving the foundations of Japan's technological and economic success. A discourse of adventure and exploration engulfed this quote unquote invention of China, visible also in this quote from an interview I conducted with the director of a Silicon Valley funded incubator program that had opened up in Shenzhen in 2012. So Chinese people here are articulated as making things happen and as providing agency to the Western innovator, engineer, and designer who had begun to increasingly fear precarity, gig work, and the feminization of his own creative labor. Shenzhen, these men promised, was a place where one could feel again in control. The casual reference to the pop science fiction series Star Trek that you see here at the end of the quote of boldly going where no man has gone before is not to underestimate in this context. As a narrative of American frontierism, references to Star Trek, and I heard them over and over again in my research in Shenzhen, legitimized an engagement with China based on a masculine and colonial narrative of adventure, exploration, and technological mastery. So if space was the final frontier to be mastered by individuals empowered by the latest technological advances, which is sort of the story of Star Trek, here in this context, China was framed as the untamed land of copycat to be mastered by the maker turned entrepreneur. In 2013, I spent a year embedded as an ethnographer in one such foreign-funded incubator program in Shenzhen. The promotional materials of the program claimed that it was taking the maker movement to the next level. It invested, so to say, in makers whose prototypes promised to scale into particular kinds of products, data-driven solutions, robots, drones, smart systems, Internet of Things, wearable technologies, and so on. Backed by a Silicon Valley venture capital firm that had strategically located its headquarters in Ireland for tax reduction purposes, the investors and managers that ran the incubator program were a group of powerful white men who were well known in the circles of global capital investment. They appropriated socialist imagery of China's past to pitch the location of their program in Shenzhen in revolutionary terms, and you see an example here. So by embedding themselves in the city's electronic markets and in its factories and supply chains, makers would learn how to become quote unquote real world entrepreneurs, so the program promised. They would no longer tinker with electronics in a makerspace, but they would hack economies of scale, global supply chains, and capitalism itself. In chapters 4 and 5 of the book, I show in much detail how this socialist pitch of entrepreneurial life in Shenzhen that refashioned colonial discourses of frontier making, of mastery and control, operates as a market device of finance capitalism. In other words, it remoralized the economization of humans and things. So the economization of life, which refers to the idea that life itself should serve the interests of investors and markets, here is portrayed as hopeful and as providing individuals with a hacktivist agency. In the political and economic regime of tech innovation and venture capitalist expansion is pitched as participatory, as available to all of us, to everyone. Processes of economization and capitalist expansion in that sense no longer appear to be just a natural consequence of competition, but rather appear to be hackable, something we can make our own. So in other words, the neoliberal doctrine of inevitability, so this idea that capitalist expansion and things like automation are just a natural process rather than the outcome of human choices, is imbued here with a feeling of agency. In other words, economic life is framed as entrepreneurial life. So during my ethnographic engagement with the incubator program, I spent much time with two women, Sophie and Mei Yun, who were hired as two Chinese staff workers by the incubator. This is how the European director of the incubator introduced the two women on the first day of the program. He said, there's a thing about Sophie and Mei Yun. They're the office managers. They make our lives better. They will make sure shit works around here. If it doesn't work, just remember, it must be their fault. Repeat after me, nothing is my fault. It must be their fault. When shit is broken, talk to them. The introduction to the two female Chinese staff set the tone for how the startup teams would approach them over the months to follow. So their job was to help guide the startup teams, many of them, a big majority of them from the US, and many of them male. So to guide these teams through the emotional ups and downs of their entrepreneurial labor in Shenzhen. So when shit was broken, they would fix it. When the stress levels amongst the startup teams went up, Sophie and Mei Yun would provide distraction and think of fun leisure activities. So their responsibility was, unlike the startups, to stay in the background, to take care of the program's day-to-day functioning and the startups' well-being. It also included the labor to organize and accompany factory tours. So these factory tours were really crucial for foreign startups in particular, not only to build relationships to potential partners in manufacturing, but also to produce the kind of affect of entrepreneurial life that many had come to associate with Shenzhen. So again, this feeling that by embedding themselves into China's manufacturing and supply chain networks, people would be able to hack and intervene on a scale of the political economy that seemed typically out of reach for designers and engineers. So over my many years of research, I met many young women and also some young men hired into positions, not unlike Sophie and Mei Yun. They were hired to perform what I call happiness labor. That is the work that goes into producing a feeling of optimism and cheerful delight. It is not unlike what Arlie Hochschild has described as emotional labor, but more specifically is the kind of labor that a range of new organizational models of tech production rely on. So think incubators, co-working spaces, maker spaces, open innovation labs. So they rely on this form of labor to sustain the precarious conditions of entrepreneurial life that they demand and celebrate. So in other words, happiness labor allows the entrepreneur to sustain a good feeling about technology, despite the increasing realization that for many, the self-investment will never pay off and is indeed very precarious. Many of the young women and men I found employed in jobs like these in China spoke fluent English, which they had acquired either through rigorous self-study or through college education. Many of them were also severely underpaid and were often paid about the same or at times even less than the migrant workers employed in the electronics factories in the region. Over time, the kind of happiness labor that was part of Sophie and Mei Yun's work became normalized amongst the startup teams. They began relating to them as friends and saw their labor as a form of peer production, as is visible in this quote here from one of the startup members in the program. So the startup's revision of Sophie and Mei Yun's role from a worker to a peer, I argue, masked the gendered divisions of labor at the incubator and the uneven positionality between the firm's female Chinese employees and the mostly white and male entrepreneurs that it invested in. Following the 2015 government initiative by China's Prime Minister on mass maker spaces, with which I began this talk, spaces like the Silicon Valley funded incubator, where I conducted my fieldwork in 2013, had become a model of sorts for a gradual but massive urban upgrade of Shenzhen. So old production sites like the Shenzhen electronic markets depicted here on the left side of the screen were redesigned to look like the incubator and maker spaces the government had identified as cultivating an entrepreneurial maker spirit amongst the masses. And on the right here, you see a redesign of the electronic markets here, just a couple of years. So the photo on the left is taken in 2013 and the photo on the right is taken in 2015. So just to give you an example of this aesthetic urban upgrade of Shenzhen. So this aesthetic upgrade of the city was meant to build what I call the entrepreneurial factory. The entrepreneurial factory operates by not so much producing products, but producing feelings, so producing affect. In the particular context of China, the entrepreneurial factory is aimed at inducing in workers and engineers of China's industrial production industry the desire to see themselves as passionate entrepreneurial change makers, to turn themselves into assets on behalf of the nation, and to serve the government's project of industrial upgrade, like its Made in China 2025 initiatives and its global development projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm happy to talk more about these initiatives in the Q&A if people are interested. The entrepreneurial factory, so to say, then operates alongside what the autonomist and feminist Marxists have called the social factory. So they coined that term to describe how capital subsumes various aspects of social life for the purposes of value accumulation. So I used the concept of the entrepreneurial factory to demonstrate that it is not only true that factory-like exploitation is seeping into various corners of our lives, which was the sort of notion of what the social factory was trying to explain, but that the inverse is the case as well, that factory work itself is increasingly shaped by the kinds of exploitation we see happening in incubators, in the creative and tech industries. So in my research, I followed several young men working in manufacturing who the entrepreneurial factory enrolled in order to understand how it affected them. One of them was Robin. When I first met Robin, he was 30 years old, and this is an image of him at the time. He had moved to Shenzhen from a rural part of China at the urging of a relative who helped him obtain a fellowship at a local manufacturer to leave behind a life in agriculture. I stayed in touch with Robin over the years. In 2016, I visited his office at the outskirts of the city. He had invited me to meet over tea to tell me about an exciting new business opportunity. A childhood friend from his hometown had opened up a shoe factory in Ethiopia. The idea was that Robin would get a section of the factory to have some of his own electronic products assembled there. The shoe factory's promotional materials that Robin showed me that day signaled more than an attractive business venture. Echoing some of the official rhetoric of the CCP around its Belt and Road Initiative, the story here was one about mutual growth, win-win, with China's own history of rapid economic development posited as a model for Africa. Robin explained to me, though, that there was no direct government support, so he didn't receive any funds to do any of this work. The expectation, so to say, was that China's entrepreneurs would self-invest by what is called in Chinese, 出去, going out, so going abroad, and implementing some of these aspirations of the Belt and Road Initiative. While the personal and professional risks could be quite high, going out was understood as carrying potential to redeem China. So that's what many people, including Robin, told me. So this was an opportunity to redeem China from a place known as fake, as low quality, into a place known for cutting edge innovation by way of upgrading themselves from a backwards farmer, a backwards producer, into a globally savvy tech entrepreneur. In the words of Robin, this is a matter of feeling responsible, he told me. In Shenzhen, people push you to go further, but our responsibility, our mission also becomes our burden. We are responsible for many workers, and this makes us feel like we cannot stop, we cannot let go. So a year later, when I returned to Shenzhen and met with Robin again, he had moved to a new office, and this is an image of the building it's located in, which is one of Shenzhen's newest and most prime real estates, Shenzhen Bay. As we sat in his new office, 30 floors up the modern high-rise overlooking a pristine golf course landscape, he showed me the video conferencing system that he had set up and the photos from his latest trips to Ethiopia and Kenya. And as he was telling me this, he suddenly interrupted himself saying, "But this is not it, Silvia." And he said, "I envy you. You're respected no matter where you go. When I go to Africa, if I went to the United States, I'm not respected. That's why we still have aspirations. That's why we hope to be respected. This is my goal. I'm pursuing this goal. And that's why, although today I could have a really good life, I'm still living the life of a loser." So the entrepreneurial factory runs on this very promise of the good life that Robin articulates here, which was continuously postponed for many Chinese men like Robin, deemed low quality and still not representative of the nation's modern ambitions, and especially for many Chinese women who were relegated to happiness labor. A couple of days after my visit, Robin sent me a WeChat message with the following news clipping from the Daily Mail in the UK. "Shenzhen, China's reform pioneer, leads the tech revolution" was the heading. And not without a hint of pride, Robin directed me to read the article till the end, where it featured him right next to one of the American investors who had begun play a key role in the city. It is this attachment to whiteness, I argue, that promised happiness and to overcome racism in the present that made many people I encountered in China's manufacturing industry to endure the violence of the entrepreneurial factory that demanded of them to take more and more risks by going out and investing in themselves rather than getting government support to do so, demanded of them to self-economize, to overwork, and to take responsibility, as Robin had articulated it, on behalf of the nation and the party state. So I built here with this notion on the critical race and feminist scholar and philosopher Sarah Ahmed's notion of the promise of happiness. Ahmed explains, "The civilizing mission of the colonial periods could be described as a happiness mission. Colonized people were framed as lacking the qualities or attributes necessary for a happy state of existence. So almost the same, but not quite, almost the same, but not white, almost happy, but not quite." The Chinese government continuously and strategically invokes China's past of partial colonization by Europe in the 19th and early 20th century, which it refers to as the period of national humiliation. It portrays citizens like Robin as lacking in civility and quality and as in need of modern upgrade. Only then will the nation be redeemed. Only then can it overcome this humiliating past of foreign occupation and Western imperialism. So the entrepreneurial factory, I argue, posits certain people and certain spaces as the right prototypes of China's indigenous innovation economy, of the Chinese dream, which is a key phrase of President Xi Jinping, of China as a happy and optimistic nation. And again, here's the image of the Prime Minister positing some of the makers he met in the makerspace Chaihua, with which I began this talk, as these kinds of right kind of prototypes and model makers. It was via the appropriation of making, so in its associations with happiness and agencies, that the CCP could pitch itself, so that the Chinese government could pitch itself as acting in the interests of the people, as committed to people's pursuits of happiness. So in other words, the Chinese government appears as a benevolent, optimistic peer of the people who works right in step with people's dreams and hopes for justice. Under President Xi Jinping, this pursuit of happiness, feminist scholar Chia Yang shows, has been rendered a moral imperative for the quality citizen. The CCP, which is more commonly associated with top-down authoritarian control, governs select groups of its citizenry via the promise of happiness. So happiness might be granted, for instance, if and only if people like Robin find ways on their own to go out to places like Ethiopia on behalf of the nation, to work alongside the CCP and its ambitions of infrastructural upgrade and its ambitions to reposition China globally via initiatives like the Belt and Road program. So I now turn to some concluding thoughts to tie this all together and bring this also into a discussion around contemporary China-US politics. The idea that China constitutes a place to prototype alternatives to existing models of modern technological progress would have sounded absurd to most people 10 years ago when I began the research that informs this book. This is much less so the case more recently. Western China commentators and news media have variously proliferated a sense that we are witnessing the rise of an emboldened China, one that more forcefully and assertively demands that the world, and the West in particular, ought to take it seriously as an equal or a threatening player in the global political economy and in technology innovation in particular. And you can see some of the examples of recent news coverage that talks about the rise of a new tech Cold War between China and the United States, this notion of China as a surveillance state, specifically speaking to the role that AI now plays in some of these narratives. And indeed, some speculate that the 21st century will be China's century. My book complicates such narratives of what the historian Gabriel Hecht calls rupture talk. I argue that the notion of rupture, of this suddenly newly emboldened, newly innovative, or newly threatening China cannot explain China's current moment, nor the ideals of the maker movement. Indeed, rupture talk renders invisible the contingencies between past and present dreams of China as an alternative model to the West, the rise and spread of the promise of making, and the machineries of the entrepreneurial factories. These contingencies are rendered invisible if we stick with sort of a trope of rupture and newness here. The book then attends to exactly these occluded contingencies of colonial pasts, of racialized othering, that co-produce China as prototype nation today. So for instance, I've shown in this talk today that the ideals and practices of a global maker movement and the imaginary of a quote unquote new China were co-produced amidst a broadening suspicion of the tech industry. The tenacity of technological promise in this very moment of a broadening critique of the tech industry dependent, I showed, on the select recruitment of once excluded bodies on sites. So some Chinese men, for instance, right, who are now enrolled in sort of the promise of making the nation anew. In the entrepreneurial factory, certain forms of life are subsumed under capital production, while others are continuously excluded. It is in these exclusions, however, that we can also find gaps in the seemingly smooth operations of finance capitalism and tech innovation. I channel here the feminist anthropologist Anna Tsing, who reminds us, if we end the story with decay, we abandon all hope or turn our attention to other sites of promise and ruin, promise and ruin. As a feminist ethnography, Prototype Nation attends to the labor, bodies, places, instruments, and techniques that are necessary to cultivate and maintain entrepreneurial life, like the happiness labor I've described today. I argue that if we attend to this form of labor, it becomes clear that the entrepreneurial factory is not inevitable, but that it has to be nurtured and maintained. So if we notice this labor, we also realize that the relationship between technology and markets can be otherwise. For instance, does not have to be rooted in these forms of exploitation. This requires us also, I argue, to attend to modes of resistance that look different from the familiar image of the countercultural hacker who attacks and tears down the system. Throughout the book, and especially in chapter 5, I document the fleeting, ambiguous, and complicit acts of resistance that happiness workers engaged in. It was in their seeming futility, in their non-compliance with pitching, wherein we can notice a gap in the functional alignment of dreaming of better futures on the one hand, and the anticipatory logics of finance capitalism on the other hand. And with this final remark, I want to end here and like to thank you so much for being here today. Here's some more information about me and how you can reach me, my website and Twitter handle.